Welcome back to the Tax Law Channel. I'm Scott Drake with my guest, the tax lawyer, Robert W. Wood with Wood LLP in San Francisco, and a frequent contributor, and I mean daily, to Forbes.com. This is an article he's written regarding a Supreme Court victory for the taxpayer regarding the statute of limitations for the IRS audit procedure. And Rob, welcome back.
Thank you.
So what happened here? What did the Supreme Court say?
Well, this is a huge case, a huge victory. Not too many tax cases end up in the U.S. Supreme Court to begin with, and this was a very important one. The Supreme Court said 3 years means 3 years, I guess at its most basic, in question before the court, and it was resolving a split around the country in different circuit courts. But before the court was the question whether the IRS gets 3 years or 6 years in cases of basis overstatements. And by that, what I mean is the normal IRS statute of limitations on your tax return is 3 years. So 3 years after you file the return, in most cases, the statute runs and you no longer have to keep all your receipts and basically be prepared to prove that you were entitled to what you claimed. So that's an important date for a lot of people. 6 years is the statute, and this is in the Internal Revenue Code, so this hasn't changed. 6 years is the one that applies to a tax return if you omitted 25% or more of your gross income. So, for example, you made $500,000, but you only put on your tax return $200,000 or $250,000, let's say. You didn't list the rest of it. In that case, it's very clear the statute is 6 years after you file. The question before the Supreme Court was, what if it's not an omission from income, but an overstatement of basis? And the court, had to look at that specific fact pattern, analyze whether it was covered by the statute, and look at prior case law, at regulations, and other things to resolve the point.
So what does then, going back to the basis for the article here, so what does this mean now? What changes now for the taxpayer?
Well, I think the big thing that a couple of things that change. I guess on its most fundamental level, nothing changed, and nothing changed. Meaning, still the basic 3-year rule is the rule that applies to most people and to most tax returns. And I think honestly, the IRS tracks the 3-year statute carefully. So they're always careful to make sure that they are auditing and when they're looking at someone. In my experience over the last 32 years as a tax lawyer is that the 6-year statute, that is when they're trying to go back more than 3 years, generally comes up only in existing audits. This is where I've seen it, where they're looking at, say, Scott, your return from 3 years ago, and then they say, well, wait a minute, we see all these losses you deducted for real estate, let's say, and did you do it in the prior year as well? And they can ask questions, and they can say, we want your prior year return, and that kind of thing. And there are sort of clear procedures for how you would nip that kind of claim in the bud. But more of that's been happening on this because of this sort of ambiguity about the 6-year statute, and I think especially in tax shelters. And so I think for most of us, you could say, even though this is an important case, not too much will change or has changed. I think that this was, as I point out in the article, a tax shelter case involving an aggressive transaction, and the basis overstatements were somewhat complicated. How they were done, and these involved, big entities, big law firms, big accounting firms, and the IRS basically got its comeuppance with the Supreme Court saying, your arguments don't work. It's 3 years means 3 years.
And then I guess, of course, if the IRS deems that the return is somehow fraudulent, then all the statute of limitations things go by the wayside then, right?
They do, but once again, that doesn't impact too many people. And I think one common taxpayer fear is, well, gosh, can't the IRS just say I was fraudulent, and or that the return was fraudulent, and doesn't that give them carte blanche to go back 6 years or even more? And the answer to that is that the standards of proof are pretty high. I mean, for the IRS to prevail in court, and they know that. So it doesn't really happen much. Again, as a practicing tax lawyer, I see the 3-year statute in operation all the time. Occasionally, the 6-year statute where you have this omission from income, and that's important for people to know about. But you know, and very occasionally I see the fraud argument, you know, in play. But for most people, 3 years. And I guess, Scott, turning to what has changed, I think one other point to emphasize before we you know, before we stop here is regulations. I mean, the IRS is issuing regulations all the time, and one of the issues in the case, underlying the case, was some regulations that the IRS implemented retroactively, and that became very controversial. I mean, interestingly, the Supreme Court ignores that on the whole, but I think for most people, because the Supreme Court didn't allow the IRS to do what it did and said 3 years means 3 years, I think that's viewed as a signal by most taxpayers, as a signal that the IRS was basically cut back in its authority. And once again, I think most taxpayers would be comforted by that guidance.
And so what you're saying, even though I know it's a 3-year statute of limitations, I still have tax returns going back to 1983. I can dump all those, right?
Actually, you know, no. I think, and there, as far as I know, there's no rule that says this anywhere. But I would distinguish. But Scott, you raise a great point. I would distinguish between tax returns and tax records. So I think you should keep, and I think everyone should keep, their tax returns forever. You know, I mean, we obviously, if you have tax returns for, if you live to be 90 and you started, you know, your parents started, as people do with kids these days when they're filing when they're very young, you may have a whole pile of returns. But I think tax records, you know, receipts and things of that sort, after 3 years, but frankly, just to be on the safe side, more like after 6, you can certainly dispose of those. But I would keep tax returns forever.
All right, Rob, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this has been a service of ATG Trust here on the Legal Broadcast Network.